90 seconds in the air. The moment the flak hit, the world split in two. Before and after. The before was cold metal, roaring engines, the steady hum of the B-17 slicing through the sky. The after was chaos, screaming alarms, choking smoke, the sickening lurch as the fortress bucked like a wounded beast. Billy Harper had flown enough missions to know when a plane was done for. The controls were sluggish, the nose tipping down, flames licking the starboard wing. The number 3 engine was coughing out black smoke like a dying dragon. Somewhere in the back, someone was yelling, but the words were lost in the frantic pounding of his own heartbeat. The intercom crackled. It was Murphy, the tail gunner. Or maybe Harris, the bombardier. Hard to tell through the static and the wheeze of a dying aircraft. Bail out, bail out. 90 seconds. That's what he had. Maybe less. Billy's fingers moved on instinct, flipping switches, cutting fuel to the burning engine. No use. The nose was dipping too fast. He could hear the wind screaming past the bullet-riddled fuselage, the jagged edges of metal vibrating like a death rattle. He turned his head, catching Johnny Parker's wide eyes in the co-pilot's seat. Parker's hands were locked onto the yoke, knuckles white, a man gripping onto life, even when it was slipping between his fingers. Billy shouted, though he doubted Parker even heard him. "Get out, Johnny." The younger man hesitated, then unbuckled, pushing away from the seat. Billy followed, one last glance at the cockpit, at the dials and gauges that had been his world for so many missions. The altimeter was spinning down. Too fast. He stumbled towards the open hatch, heat from the fire clawing at his back. The B-17 shuddered, groaning like an old man on his last breath. Through the hatch, the sky yawned open, blue and endless, speckled with black bursts of flak. Below, the earth looked distant and different. The fields of Germany stretched out like a patchwork quilt of green and brown. Somewhere down there, men were waiting. Men with rifles. Billy took a deep breath and jumped. The air hit like a freight train. One moment, Billy was in the belly of a dying fortress. The next, he was weightless, spinning, tumbling through nothing. The roar of the engines was gone, replaced by the howling wind ripping at his flight suit, clawing at his limbs, trying to twist him into a ragdoll. He forced his arms out, struggling for control, his body spiraling as the world flipped end over end. Sky, earth, sky, earth. His breath came in ragged gulps. Somewhere above, the B-17 was still falling, trailing smoke like a wounded comet, fire licking at its insides. It wouldn't be long before it hit. A glimpse of movement, another parachute opening somewhere to his left. Someone else had made it out. Parker? Harris? Maybe Murphy. No way to tell. No time to check. Billy reached for the ripcord. His fingers found it, clenched, yanked. The parachute snapped open with a force that jerked his entire body, knocking the air from his lungs. The straps dug into his shoulders, biting like teeth, but the spinning stopped. The wind still howled, but he was floating now, drifting. Below, the earth rushed up to meet him. He could see the fields more clearly now. Clusters of trees, a winding road, a village in the distance. Smoke from burning wreckage smudged the sky, the remains of another bomber that hadn't been so lucky. Then movement. Tiny figures below, near a farmhouse. Dark uniforms. Soldiers. Billy's gut tightened. No more time to think. No more time at all. Billy twisted in the harness, trying to steer the parachute, but the wind had other plans. He was dropping fast, straight toward a cluster of trees near the farmhouse. His heart pounded as he yanked at the straps, his breath coming in short gasps. He wasn't ready. Not for the landing. Not for what came after. The ground surged up to meet him. He braced, knees bent, arms tucked, just like they'd drilled back in training. The impact was harder than he expected. His boots slammed into the dirt, momentum dragging him forward. He tumbled, the parachute billowing like a dying thing behind him, his body rolling through grass and broken branches until he came to a stop, chest heaving. For a moment, all he could hear was his own breathing, the distant rumble of engines, the faint crackle of fire from the wreckage. Then shouting. Billy snapped his head up. The soldiers were moving, dark figures against the golden fields, their rifles slung across their backs as they ran toward him. He had seconds, maybe less. His fingers fumbled at the parachute harness, unbuckling, tearing himself free. He scrambled to his feet, muscles screaming. A sharp pain lanced through his right ankle. Twisted? Maybe. Didn't matter. He had to move. He bolted toward the trees, breath burning in his lungs, adrenaline dulling the pain. The undergrowth whipped against his flight suit, snagging, slowing him down. Behind him, the voices grew louder. The sound of boots pounding against the dirt. Then gunfire. Bullets snapped through the air, tearing into the branches above. Bark exploded in sharp bursts. Billy ducked, stumbled, forced himself forward. His body screamed at him to stop, to rest, to surrender. But he couldn't. He wasn't dying here. Not today. Billy pushed deeper into the trees, lungs burning, the shots behind him growing sharper, closer. His right ankle was useless now. Every step sent fire up his leg, but stopping meant death. The German soldiers were trained for this. They hunted men like him. And he was bleeding. Somewhere along the tumble, a jagged branch had torn into his arm, the warm trickle soaking into his flight suit. The ground beneath him sloped downward, a narrow ravine cutting through the forest. A stream ran at the bottom, shallow but fast-moving. No time to think. He slid down the bank, landing hard on his side, pain exploding in his ribs. Above, boots crunched against the leaves. The soldiers were scanning, searching. Billy pressed himself against the muddy bank, barely daring to breathe. The cold water lapped at his boots. He strained to listen, picking apart the sounds, the distant engines, the caw of crows, the clipped, deliberate voices speaking a language he barely understood. Then a silence. A pause. He knew what that meant. They'd split up. The Germans were smart. They knew he was wounded. Knew he wouldn't get far. They'd box him in, move slow, flush him out like a rabbit from the brush. Billy's fingers found a smooth rock in the mud. He gripped it tight, forcing his breathing steady. His body screamed for rest, for relief. But his mind was sharper than it had ever been. He thought of the B-17 burning in the sky. He thought of Parker, of Harris, of Murphy. Had they made it? Were they running like he was, hiding in some damn ditch, praying to a god they weren't sure was listening? Twigs snapped. Billy tensed. A shadow moved at the top of the ravine. He had seconds, maybe less. Billy pressed himself lower into the mud, heart hammering against his ribs. The shadow above shifted, a soldier, no more than 10 feet away, scanning the ravine. His rifle was raised, the barrel gleaming in the dim light filtering through the trees. He was young, couldn't have been more than 20. The kind of kid Billy might have passed on the street back home in Ohio, the kind who should have been worried about baseball scores and Friday night dances, not hunting down airmen in the woods of Germany. The soldier hesitated. Billy barely breathed. Then a shout in the distance. One of the others had found something. The soldier turned his head, answering in sharp, clipped German. His rifle lowered a fraction. His boot shifted. Billy didn't think. He launched himself from the mud, exploding upward in a desperate lunge. The soldier barely had time to turn before Billy's shoulder slammed into him, sending them both tumbling down the bank. The rifle flew from the young man's hands, skidding across the rocks. Billy landed on top, his knees digging into the soldier's chest, his fists swinging. The first punch connected. So did the second. The third missed. The soldier twisted, grabbing at Billy's arms, struggling, panicked. He was strong, but Billy had something stronger, desperation. He grabbed a fistful of dirt and slammed it into the man's face. The soldier choked, coughed, flailed. Billy lunged for the rifle. A shot rang out. For a split second, neither of them moved. The soldier's eyes widened, mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Blood bloomed across his uniform. Then he slumped back, body going limp. Billy stared. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. His hands were shaking. He had killed men before, up there in the sky through crosshairs, behind the safety of a machine gun. But this was different. No time to think. The others would have heard the shot. Billy grabbed the rifle, wiped the sweat from his face, and ran. The forest swallowed him whole. Billy ran until his legs refused to carry him any farther. His lungs burned, his vision blurred at the edges, but he couldn't stop, not yet. Not while the echoes of that gunshot still rang in his ears. The trees thinned ahead, giving way to an open field. Beyond it, nestled between rolling hills, was a small village, stone houses with slanted roofs, smoke curling from chimneys, narrow streets winding like veins. A church steeple rose at the far end, a clock face gleaming in the fading sunlight. Billy hesitated at the tree line, his body screaming for rest, his mind racing. That village could mean shelter, or it could mean a noose around his neck. The Germans would be looking for him now, sweeping the forest, checking the roads. He had to assume they'd search the village too. But what choice did he have? His ankle was useless, swollen to the size of a fist. He wouldn't last another night in the cold. And the blood on his sleeve, he didn't know how deep the wound was, but he was getting weaker. Billy took a breath and stepped into the open. The fields stretched out before him, golden with dry grass, a few scattered barns dotting the land. He moved as fast as his body allowed, keeping low, staying in the shadows where he could. His stolen rifle felt heavier with every step. As he neared the village, movement caught his eye, a figure standing in the doorway of a farmhouse, watching him. An old woman wrapped in a shawl, her face lined with years of hard living. She didn't run, didn't call for help, just stared. Billy raised a hand, not sure if it was a greeting or a plea. The woman's eyes flicked to the rifle, then to his torn flight suit, then back to his face. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Then silently, she stepped aside, leaving the door open. Billy swallowed hard. He glanced back at the fields, at the forest where death was still searching for him. Then he limped forward, into the unknown. Inside, the farmhouse was dim, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and something cooking over a low fire. Billy hesitated just past the threshold, muscles tense, fingers still tight around the stolen rifle. The woman didn't speak. She simply closed the door behind him and turned toward a wooden table where a single candle flickered against the gloom. Billy scanned the room. Stone walls, a simple hearth, rough-hewn furniture. No signs of a radio. No signs of German uniforms. But that didn't mean she wasn't hiding one of them in the next room. The woman motioned toward a chair, a command, or an invitation. Billy's legs were shaking too much to argue. He lowered himself onto the chair, wincing as the pain in his ankle flared. His fingers twitched around the rifle. He should have ditched it before coming here. Bringing a German weapon into a stranger's home was asking for trouble. But out there, in the fields, it had been his only lifeline. The woman disappeared into another room. A moment later, she returned with a small basin of water and a torn cloth. Without a word, she reached for his arm. Billy flinched. She clicked her tongue, disapproving. Then she pulled back the sleeve of his flight suit, exposing the gash beneath. Dried blood crusted the edges, fresh blood still seeping from where the fabric had stuck to the wound. The woman exhaled sharply, shaking her head, then dipped the cloth into the water and pressed it against his skin. Billy sucked in a sharp breath. It burned like hell. Still, he let her work. Somewhere outside, voices echoed, distant but growing closer. Soldiers, moving through the village. Billy tensed. The woman didn't stop. She kept dabbing at his wound, her expression unreadable, her hands steady. But her eyes flicked toward the door, just for a second. A silent warning. They were coming. Billy's breath slowed. His pulse pounded against his ribs. He forced himself not to move, not to make a sound. The woman met his gaze, her face betraying nothing. Then calmly she stood across the room and picked up the kettle from the fire. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, demanding. Billy's grip tightened around the rifle. The woman turned, looked at him, and in a voice barely above a whisper, said one word. Stay. Then she moved to answer the door. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold air. Billy barely breathed, his fingers white-knuckled around the rifle. His heart pounded so hard he swore the soldiers outside could hear it. The woman stood in the doorway, blocking most of his view. He could see only their boots, polished leather, caked with mud from the fields. 4 pairs, maybe 5. A sharp voice barked something in German. Question. The woman answered, her tone even, unshaken. Billy didn't understand the words, but he understood the game. She was lying. Another voice joined in, deeper, calmer, more dangerous. A single, deliberate step forward, the wooden floor groaning beneath his weight. Then the unmistakable sound of a rifle strap shifting. Billy's grip tightened. If they stepped inside, if they saw him. The woman moved. Slowly, deliberately. He heard the clink of porcelain, the soft scrape of a chair against the floor, a cup being placed on the table. She was offering them tea. The soldiers hesitated. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the deeper voice chuckled, a low, throaty sound. A joke, maybe. One of the other soldiers muttered something in response. Boots shuffled. The wood creaked again. And then, the door closed. Billy sat frozen, his body still wired for a fight that hadn't come. He listened. The soldiers' voices faded, their footsteps retreating into the night. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked. The woman turned. Her face was unreadable. Billy exhaled, his whole body sagging with relief. She studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke, her voice quiet, firm. "If you want to live," she said in slow, careful English, "you must leave before sunrise." Billy nodded. He didn't ask why she had helped him. He didn't ask what would happen to her if the Germans found out. Some things didn't need to be said. For the first time since falling from the sky, Billy let himself believe he might survive this. But dawn was coming, and with it new dangers. The night had saved him. But the morning, that was a different story.